The rain came sideways on Gwanghwamun Boulevard, the kind that made umbrellas useless. Jalani had given up on hers 2 blocks back. At 11:52 p.m., roughly 40 minutes after the last campus shuttle had already pulled away without her. 12 hours in the chemistry library. Her neck had locked somewhere around the 3rd hour, her notes had blurred somewhere around the 7th, and her scholarship review was still 2 weeks away and nowhere near ready. Her jacket was soaked through. Her braids, half escaped from their puff, clung cold against her neck. All she needed was her bed, her blanket, to disappear from this city until morning. She almost walked past the alley. It was the hand she noticed first, pale against the black asphalt, positioned at an angle no sleeping person would ever choose. She stopped, looked again. A man, dark suit, white shirt soaked gray with rain, silver at his temples, lying completely still in the narrow gap between a shuttered food cart and a concrete wall. The street lamp above him flickered, then held. She stood at the alley entrance for 3 full seconds. In her head, she ran the math. She was foreign. It was midnight. She had no Korean beyond "excuse me" and "how much does this cost?" Whatever world this man belonged to, expensive suit, empty street, a city block that had somehow gone completely quiet, it was not her world, not her problem. Then she watched his chest. It wasn't moving. She went in. She knelt on the wet asphalt beside him, pressed 2 fingers beneath his jaw. A pulse faint, but there. His breathing came in short, shallow pulls, like a man fighting for something he didn't have the strength to name. His phone lay face down beside him, screen still lit from the impact of the fall. She turned it over. Recent calls. 1 contact, no photo, no title, just 2 characters, Kootsemin Anus. Romanized beneath it, Yimin. She looked at the man on the ground, looked at the phone, made a decision she would spend the next 3 months trying to understand. She pressed call. 2 rings. Who is this? Not a question. A door being opened slowly by someone standing just behind it in the dark. Jalani's jaw tightened. Her free hand pressed flat against the man's chest, steadying herself more than him. "Your father," she said, "is lying in the rain, and he's not waking up." Silence, the kind that has weight. Then quietly, "Don't move him, don't go anywhere, I'll know if you do." The line cut. She stayed exactly where she was, rain hammering the asphalt around her, the man's pulse a faint drumbeat beneath her fingers, and somewhere behind her, at the mouth of the alley, she heard the sound of tires. They came without sirens. 3 black sedans, moving in tight formation, headlights cutting through the rain like something that had never learned the word hurry because it had never needed to. They stopped at the alley entrance in perfect unison. Doors opened. Men stepped out, 4, 6, 8, and none of them looked at Jalani the way people looked at strangers. They looked at her the way cameras did. She didn't stand. Some instinct she couldn't name told her that standing right now would feel like a threat. So she stayed on her knees in the wet asphalt, one hand still pressed to the older man's chest, and she waited. The last door opened. He wasn't the tallest. He wasn't the broadest. But every man on that street adjusted their posture when Han Yimin stepped out, a barely visible straightening like iron filings near a magnet. He was younger than she'd expected. Late 30s, maybe. Dark coat, collar up against the rain that didn't seem to touch him the way it touched everything else. His face gave nothing away. Not fear, not relief, just assessment. He crossed the distance between them slowly, stopped 2 feet away, and looked down at his father. Something moved through his jaw, one muscle, gone in under a second. He crouched, not beside his father, but in front of Jalani, and studied her face with the focused patience of a man who had learned that people revealed more when they didn't know they were being read. "You made the call," he said, English clean and cold. "Yes." "You didn't take anything." It wasn't a question either, but she answered it. "No." Why not? Jalani held his gaze. Her knees ached. Her jacket was soaked through to her skin. She was exhausted and afraid and furious at herself for being afraid, and none of that was going to help her right now. Because he needed help, she said. That's it, that's the whole reason. Yi Min looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood and said something sharp in Korean. Two men moved immediately, producing a folded stretcher from the second sedan with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this before. Jalani finally rose. Her legs were stiff. She stepped back to give them room and turned toward the alley entrance, her eyes on the rain-slicked street, calculating the walk back to campus, already trying to fold this night into something she could set down and leave. Miss. She stopped. She didn't turn around immediately. She allowed herself one breath, just one, before she looked back over her shoulder. Yi Min stood with his hands in his coat pockets, his father now being moved with careful, practiced hands behind him. You live in the international residences, he said. Building C, third floor. Her stomach dropped. Come with us, he said. Or don't, but understand I already know where to find you. The compound sat behind a wall of frosted glass and motion sensors, somewhere in the hills above Seongbukdong, where the city's noise couldn't reach it. Jalani counted 4 security checkpoints between the gate and the front entrance. She stopped counting after that. Inside was worse. Not because it was cold or cruel. It wasn't. The floors were pale stone, the ceilings high, the lighting the kind that cost money to look effortless. There were flowers on the console table in the entrance hall. Fresh ones. But the beauty of it had the same quality as Yi Min's face in the alley, composed, deliberate, and entirely impossible to read beneath. A woman named Suah showed her to a room on the second floor. Private bathroom. A window that overlooked a garden. Folded towels on the bed, a change of clothes in her approximate size set on the chair. Jalani stood in the center of the room and understood, with a clarity that had nothing to do with gratitude, that someone had made a phone call about her before she'd ever stepped into that car. She didn't sleep. At 6 a.m, Yi Min came to her door. He was already dressed. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, still in yesterday's clothes, her damp jacket spread across the chair beside the unworn ones. He didn't apologize for the hour. My father has a private physician, he said, standing in the doorway. But the physician has a family, a home address, a daughter in secondary school. He let that sit for exactly 1 second. You have a chemistry background, pre-medicine, Dean's List, 3 consecutive semesters. Jalani said nothing. You'll monitor his condition. Vitals, medication schedule, anything the physician requires a second set of eyes on. You'll have access to everything you need. He paused. You'll stay until he's stable. And if I say no? The question came out steadier than she felt. Yi Min tilted his head slightly, the way a person did when they were considering how honest to be. You found my father unconscious in an alley at midnight, he said. Alone, with his phone in your hand when my men arrived. He held her gaze. There are people in this city who would find that story very convenient, people who would not wait to hear your explanation. The silence that followed was not empty. It had texture. Jalani looked at the window. The garden below was still gray with early morning, perfectly kept, not a single weed. Everything here was controlled, contained. She thought about her dormitory room, her scholarship files sitting open on her desk, the 12 tabs she'd had open in the library before all of this. She thought about the way his men had looked at her, like a variable, something to be managed. I'll need my laptop, she said finally, and my notes. Yi Min nodded once and stepped back from the doorway. Suah will bring them within the hour. Han Junseok was not what she had expected. She wasn't sure what she had expected, severity maybe. The same controlled blankness his son wore like a second skin. But the man in the bed was small against his pillows, his silver hair pushed back from his forehead, his breathing labored but rhythmic. His hands, folded across the blanket, had the look of hands that had done real work once. Knuckles slightly thickened, a faded scar along the left thumb. Jalani checked his IV line, reviewed the physician's notes, recorded his blood pressure in the log she'd started in the back of her chemistry notebook. Then she sat in the chair beside him and waited, the way she'd learned to wait quietly, without filling the silence. He drifted in and out for the first 2 days. On the third morning, he opened his eyes and looked directly at her, and the focus in his gaze was so sudden and complete that she nearly knocked over the monitoring equipment. "You're not Korean," he said in careful, accented English. "No." He considered this. "Where?" "Maryland, in America." He made a small sound, not quite a laugh. "Far," he said, then his eyes closed again. But he kept coming back. In fragments, in the strange half-language of fever and medication, and old age pressing against the edges of a man who had spent decades refusing to slow down. He talked about a fishing village on the south coast where he'd grown up, the third of 6 boys, the only one who'd left. He talked about a woman named Myung, the way you talked about weather like she was something that had happened to the entire landscape of your life, not just to you. He talked about Yi-min at 7 years old, how the boy had cried exactly once when his mother left, and then never again, and how Jun-seok had understood in that moment that he had built something in his son that he didn't entirely know how to be proud of. Jalani recorded vitals. She adjusted his pillows. She did not tell him to rest when he was talking, because the physician's notes had said clearly that agitation was the larger risk, and the talking seemed to calm him in a way the medication didn't. On the 4th evening, he looked at her during a moment of unusual clarity and said, "You're afraid of my son." She didn't deny it. "Yes." He nodded slowly, like she'd given the correct answer to a question he hadn't wanted to ask. "Good," he said. "Fear means you're paying attention." He turned his gaze toward the window where the garden had gone dark. "Yi-min is not cruel, he is careful. There is a difference." He paused. Sometimes he forgets there is a difference. His eyes closed. His breathing steadied. Jalani sat in the dim room for a long time after that, her pen resting unmoving against the open page. She found him on the rooftop at 2 a.m. She hadn't been looking for him. She'd woken with a headache from too many hours bent over her notebook and had gone searching for water and a window that opened. And instead she'd found a staircase door left slightly ajar, and beyond it, Han Yi-min sitting on the low concrete ledge at the roof's edge with his jacket off, and a glass of something amber resting beside him untouched. Jalani almost went back downstairs. She didn't. She crossed the rooftop slowly, giving him every opportunity to dismiss her, and stopped a few feet away. Souls spread below them in every direction, towers of light dissolving into low fog, the Han River a dark ribbon in the distance. Beautiful in the way that powerful things sometimes were, from far enough away. He didn't look at her, but he didn't tell her to leave. "How is he?" he said, not cold this time. Something had been removed from his voice that she hadn't noticed was there until it was gone. "Stable, better than yesterday." She paused. "He talked tonight about the South Coast, about fishing." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. "He always talks about the fishing. He was terrible at it." She almost smiled. Almost. She looked out at the city instead, and for a few minutes neither of them said anything, and the silence had a different quality up here than it did in the rest of the compound. Less managed. "He wasn't supposed to be in that district," Yi-min said eventually. "That night, he knew better than to go alone." He picked up the glass, turned it once in his hand, set it back down. "He still does things like that, wanders, like the city still belongs to him the way it did 30 years ago." "Maybe it does," Jalani said. "To him." Yi-min looked at her then. Directly, the way he had in the alley reading. But the quality of it was different now. Less calculating. More like a man who had not been looked at plainly in a very long time and wasn't sure what to do with the experience. "You're not what I expected," he said. "You keep knowing things about me that I haven't told you. You could have at least expected someone difficult." The corner of his mouth moved again. This time it completed itself. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then it was gone, and he was looking back at the city, and the distance between them reassembled itself quietly like a wall that knew its own job. "Get some sleep," he said. "You're no use to him exhausted." She turned to go. "Miss Brooks." She stopped. "Thank you," he said, "for staying with him tonight." Jalani didn't answer. She walked back to the staircase door and descended into the light below, and she pressed her palm flat against the cool wall of the corridor and stood there for a moment, breathing. Then she went to check on his father. She noticed it first in the silences. Not the comfortable kind. The compound had its own ambient quiet, and she'd learned to move inside it without disturbing anything. This was different. A specific hush that fell over certain rooms when a certain man entered them. The kind of quiet that happened when people were being careful. His name was Park Sungjin, Yimin's head of operations. Early 40s, broad-shouldered, with a smile he deployed the way other people deployed apologies, smoothly, slightly too late. He had been with the Han organization for 15 years, and he made sure everyone knew it, the way people mentioned tenure when they felt their position becoming uncertain. Jalani had no reason to watch him. She watched him anyway. It started on a Tuesday. She was crossing the second-floor landing with Jun Seok's medication log when she saw Sungjin step out of the communication room, a room she'd been told on her first day was restricted. He didn't see her. He was already moving, phone to his ear, his voice dropped to a register she couldn't catch from that distance. But she saw his hand. The way it pressed flat against his thigh as he walked, the fingers spread, a private gesture, self-steadying. She recognized it because she did the same thing when she was lying. She filed it away, said nothing. Then on Thursday, during Jun Seok's midday check, the old man surfaced from a light sleep and said, without preamble, "Sungjin came to see me this morning." Jalani kept her eyes on the monitor. "While I was in the lab." "He asked how I was feeling." Jun Seok's gaze drifted toward the ceiling. "Sungjin has never once asked how I was feeling, in 15 years. He paused. "He was looking at my IV." The room was very quiet. "He was probably just concerned," Jalani said carefully. Jun Seok looked at her with the particular patience of a man who had survived long enough to know the difference between naivety and performance. "Perhaps," he said. That evening, Jalani sat at her desk and opened her laptop and stared at her scholarship report without reading a word of it. She thought about the communication room, the phone call, the hand pressed flat against the thigh. She thought about the way Sungjin always positioned himself closest to the exit in any room that held Yimin. How his smile arrived half a beat after everyone else's. She thought about what Jun Seok had said on the fourth night. Fear means you're paying attention. She pulled up the compound's internal schedule. She had access to the medical calendar, nothing else, and cross-referenced Sungjin's listed meetings against the timestamps she'd noted in her log. 3 gaps, each one around 40 minutes, each one on a day when Yimin was off-site. 40 minutes was a long time to make a phone call. She closed the laptop and sat in the dark and tried to decide whose problem this was. She already knew the answer. She waited until morning. Not because she wasn't sure, she was sure, with the particular certainty that settled in the body rather than the mind, the kind that made her chest tight and her sleep shallow. She waited because she needed to be calm when she did this. She needed to walk into that room and say what she had to say without her voice betraying how afraid she was of what came after. Yimin was in the study on the ground floor. She knocked. He looked up from the papers on his desk and read her face in the span of a second. "Close the door," he said. She did. She sat in the chair across from him without being invited and placed her notebook on the desk, open to the page where she'd logged the timestamps. She walked him through it without editorializing the communication room, the phone call, the gaps in the schedule, what Junseok had said about the IV. She spoke the way she organized data, precisely, without performance. When she finished, the room was very still. Yi Min looked at the notebook for a long moment. Then he leaned back in his chair and looked at her, and the expression on his face was one she hadn't seen before. Not anger, something underneath anger, where the temperature was lower and more permanent. "How long have you known?" he asked. "I became certain 3 days ago." "And before that?" "A week, maybe more. I wasn't sure enough to say anything." He nodded slowly. "Who else have you told?" "No one." "Why not?" "Because the only people I could tell are the people I'm not sure about." Something moved through his gaze, quick, almost imperceptible. If she hadn't spent 3 weeks learning the geometry of his silences, she would have missed it entirely. He stood and walked to the window. The garden below was bright with mid-morning light. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back and was quiet for long enough that she began to understand the quiet as its own kind of answer. "If you're wrong," he said finally, "you've accused a man who has been with my family since before I took this position. A man with considerable influence over the people in this building." He didn't turn around. "That becomes your problem to carry, not mine." Jalani held very still. "And if I'm right?" He turned then. His eyes met hers across the room with a directness that felt less like a look and more like a line being drawn. "Then you've made yourself a witness to something that cannot be undone," he said, "which means your safety depends entirely on how this ends." He paused. "On how I decide it ends." The silence that followed had weight and edges. "I understand," she said. Yi Min studied her face. Whatever he was looking for, he seemed to find enough of it. "Don't leave the compound," he said, "for any reason." It started with the lights. They didn't go out all at once. That would have been too obvious, too cinematic. They flickered once, held, flickered again, and then the backup generators kicked in and bathed the medical wing in the dim amber of emergency power. Jalani looked up from Junseok's chart and felt the specific quality of the silence that followed, and understood immediately that this was not a power failure. She locked the medical wing door. Deadbolt first, then the secondary latch she'd identified on her second day purely out of habit, the way she cataloged everything. Exits, angles, the contents of every cabinet in every room she spent more than an hour in. Junseok was awake. He'd felt it too. "Stay in the bed," she said quietly. "Don't sit up." She moved to the supply cabinet. She was not a fighter. She had no weapon, no radio, no way to reach Yimin, whose phone had gone to silence the moment the generators switched. What she had was a medical wing stocked for a man with a cardiac condition, an adjacent preparation room with a locked chemical store she had full access to, and 4 years of university chemistry that her scholarship committee had funded without knowing it would one day be used for this. She thought of her professor's voice. The most dangerous reactions are the ones that look harmless until they aren't. She worked fast. Ammonia from the cleaning supplies beneath the sink, the isopropyl alcohol from the sterilization shelf. She didn't mix them. She wasn't trying to poison anyone. She wasn't capable of that. She wasn't going to let herself be capable of that. But ammonia vapor in a concentrated space was enough to clear a room in seconds, and a rag soaked in alcohol was enough to spread it, and a person blinded and choking in a corridor could not aim accurately. She heard them at the door 4 minutes later, not knocking. 2 of them, based on the sound, working on the latch with something mechanical and efficient. She positioned herself behind the door, back against the wall, the soaked rag wrapped around her forearm, the ammonia bottle open and angled low in her other hand. She looked across the room at Junseok. He was watching her from the bed with the steady, particular calm of a man who had seen a great many things and had decided, somewhere in the long course of his life, not to be undone by them. He gave her a small nod. The latch broke. The door swung inward. She moved in the same instant, low, fast, the ammonia released in a sharp, directed wave directly into the entry space. The first man recoiled immediately, hands going to his face. The second stumbled into him. She was already past them, pulling the door back hard against the second man's shoulder, throwing the bolt on the exterior lock. Then she stood in the corridor, breathing. Behind her, through the sealed door, she could hear Junseok's voice, calm, carrying, already calling out to whoever else was in the building. Good, she thought, he's breathing fine. She checked her hands, steady. She went to find Yimin. She found him in the east corridor. Not the way she'd imagined finding him, composed, delivering information cleanly the way she'd delivered the timestamps in the study. She rounded the corner and nearly walked into him, and they both stopped, and she saw immediately that whatever had happened on his end of the compound had not been clean or quiet. His collar was torn. There was blood on his left hand. Not his own, she assessed automatically. The wound pattern was wrong for self-injury. And his eyes, when they found her face, moved through something fast and unguarded before the familiar control reassembled itself. He looked at her for a long moment. My father, he said. Locked in the medical wing, he's stable. 2 of them got to the door but didn't get through. She paused. They're contained. Something passed through Yimin's jaw. That single muscle she'd learned to read. This time it didn't disappear quickly, it held, and she understood that what she was seeing was not coldness. It was a man pressing very hard against the underside of relief. You lock them in, he said. I locked myself out in the min. There's a difference. He looked at her for another moment. Then he moved past her toward the medical wing, and she followed. Junseok was sitting up when they entered, fully upright, which he absolutely should not have been. His physician would have consequences to discuss. And when Yimin crossed the room and crouched beside the bed and took his father's face briefly in both hands, Jalani turned to the window and looked at the garden and gave them that. It took perhaps 30 seconds. Then Yimin stood, and the man she'd watched on the rooftop, unguarded, tired, almost human, was folded back beneath the surface, and what remained was the version of him that ran things. He dealt with Sungjin in the courtyard. Jalani didn't watch. She stayed with Junseok, recording vitals that had remained, against all reasonable expectation, remarkably steady. She heard voices outside Yimin's, then Sungjin's rising sharply, then others. She heard the specific silence that followed and did not try to interpret it. When Yimin returned, he stood in the doorway with the courtyard dark behind him and looked at her across the room. It's done, he said. She nodded. She didn't ask what done meant. Some information was not hers to carry. Junseok spoke from his pillows, his voice dry but precise. She used the chemistry cabinet. Yimin looked at her. The ammonia. It was available. You could have hidden. Your father was in the room. He was quiet for a moment. Then, quietly, the same register he'd used on the rooftop, the one with everything removed from it. You could have run, after the corridor. The east exit was 30 meters away. Jalani met his gaze steadily. I know, she said. 3 weeks after the night in the courtyard, Jalani walked back to the university alone. Not because she had to. Yimin had offered a car, as he offered everything without framing it as an offer, simply arranging it and waiting to see if she would use it. She'd told Suah to cancel it and left through the front gate on foot, in the early morning, the way she used to leave for the library. Seoul looked the same. The boulevard noise, the smell of street food and rain-damp concrete, the particular quality of light at 7 in the morning when the city was still deciding what kind of day to be. She had walked these streets for 2 years, making herself small in them, looking at her shoes on the subway, apologizing for her Korean in shops where her Korean was perfectly functional, moving through the city like a visitor who understood, on some cellular level, that she was not supposed to take up too much space. She walked differently now. She wasn't entirely sure when it had happened. She submitted her scholarship review that afternoon. It was good, her best, actually, the kind of work that came from a person who had stopped apologizing for how their mind operated. Her professor read the first page while she stood there and looked up with an expression she hadn't seen directed at her before, not here, and said something in Korean she understood perfectly. Where did this come from? She thought about a rooftop, about a man in a hospital bed who talked about fishing, about ammonia and corridor light and the specific weight of choosing to stay. I've been here, she thought. I was just waiting to arrive. She went back to the compound that evening. She hadn't moved out. That had not been discussed directly, which meant Yi-min had decided it without requiring her agreement, which normally would have produced a very particular response from her. Somehow it hadn't. She was still examining why. He was in the study when she arrived. He looked up when she entered and waited. My review is submitted, she said. I know. She stopped. How do you know? Your professor mentioned it. You know my professor. I know everyone in this city who matters to someone I'm responsible for. He said it plainly, without apology, and held her gaze. You are currently someone I'm responsible for. Jalani stood in the doorway of the study and looked at Han Yi-min, at the precise, careful, impossible man who had threatened her in an alleyway, and thanked her on a rooftop and crouched beside his father's bed with both hands shaking. And she thought about the word responsible and all the shapes it could take. That's not what I am, she said. He looked at her steadily. No, he agreed, it isn't. The silence that followed was not empty or weighted or edged. It was, for the first time, simply shared. She crossed the room and sat down across from him, and outside the window the city spread in every direction, bright and indifferent and entirely hers. Your difference is not the thing standing between you and the life you want. In the right moment, applied with courage, it is the very thing that gets you there.